So, hello, Bible fans. I've got another Bible study for us. We're starting the book of Ecclesiastes. Here we are in 2021. What a year 2020 was. And so we're looking for wisdom. And we come to the book where it's the teacher, the wisest one. Let's see what kind of wisdom we find in Ecclesiastes. Now, the name Ecclesiastes in Hebrew actually is Koholeth or Koheleth, and it means the preacher or the teacher. And so, where do we get the name Ecclesiastes? From the Greek translation, which Ecclesiastes literally means one of the assembly. The assembly is just a group of people. So this is one of the group. But so much for translation, right? So Ecclesiastes starts by saying it's the words of Koheleth, or the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, or who was king in Jerusalem. See, here's one of the things. Tradition has it that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon, who is supposed to be the wisest king of Israel. And yet, there are scholars that think it might have been written hundreds of years after King Solomon lived and died. They think that it's influenced by Greek or Persian thinking. Maybe. We really don't know. There's nothing that tells us in the book itself. There were some that wondered, why is this included in the canon? I remember when I read Ecclesiastes when I was in high school. This was in a class. And my classmates and I agreed it was one of the most depressing books we ever read. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity, all is vain. There's no meaning to life. What kind of book is this in the Bible? Well, that's a really good question. And one of the difficulties with Ecclesiastes is it does not seem to have any belief in anything past this life. Now, in Jewish theology, in the Jewish Hebrew Bible, there is only Sheol, or the grave. There isn't paradise, there's no heaven, there's no afterlife that they know of. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. There are some claims that maybe there is in books like the end of Isaiah or in some of Daniel, but it's not really a clear teaching, especially in the Torah, especially in the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, the Old Testament, first 5 books. So Ecclesiastes does not have any concept of anything after death. And so it's all about, where do we find wisdom while we're alive in this life? So the first 2 chapters, I'm going to go through real quickly. I'm not going to read it all because I'm imagining that those who are watching this can read it. But some of the things that jump out at me when the teacher calls everything vanity, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do people gain from all the toil from which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth goes on forever. All things, verse 8, all things are wearisome, more than one can express. What has been seen and what will be and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing which can be said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them. This is the existential fact. We die. And generations later, People may not know who lived or died. That's for historians to write about. Some are remembered, most are not. And so here's the teacher bemoaning the fate of our lives. And it just seems vain to this person. Now, we live in a world of technology where everything's new. They didn't have cell phones back when the teacher wrote this. We hadn't been to the moon or Mars. Clearly, there's a lot of new stuff that they didn't know about back then. And yet, the fate of humanity remains much the same. We get angry, we get sad. We get happy, we get frightened. We are hungry, and then we're full. Nothing seems to really be different from being a human today than it was 3,000 years ago. So, in one way, he's right. We fall in love, we break up, we lose friends and parents to death. So that's the context. He's not looking specifically in technology. He's more looking at our life situation. And so in verse 16, I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And he goes on, he says, I perceived that this was but a chasing after wind. Then he goes through chapter 2. And he says, come now, I will make a test of pleasure. Enjoy yourself. He thinks, this is vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? Now think of that. We often think that pleasure is the biggest thing to chase in life. Whatever makes you feel good, right? And yet, at some point, you get tired of it. And it's like, this feels the same. This is the same pleasure that I had. I had lobster yesterday, and it tastes the same as the lobster today. Whatever it is, now, there are people that are addicted to pleasure. Don't get me wrong. But at some point, even they feel trapped by those pleasures at times. People who are addicted to substance abuse, they may feel trapped by the very pleasure that they seek. And the high they get is never the same. It always seems a little bit less than what they had before. It's the law of diminishing returns. In itself, pleasure does not give us meaning. And that's the problem. Pleasure may feel pleasurable, but there's no real meaning in it. It feels good. Okay. But what's the meaning of life? Pleasure doesn't answer that question. And so he's frustrated at that very question. In chapter 2, verse 5, I made myself gardens and parks, planted all kinds of fruit trees, made pools to growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had great possessions. I gathered silver and gold and the treasure of kings and princes, singers, delights of the flesh, and many concubines. And he says here in verse 10, I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil and was rewarded by all my toil. Then I considered all my hands had done, and all was vanity, a chasing after wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So he had riches and pleasures, and he says it's meaningless. It doesn't fulfill me. So he says, let me look at wisdom. Let me try to be wise. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe if I look for wisdom, I'll find the answer. Verse 12, chapter 2. I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can one do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. Yet I perceived that the same fate befalls all of them. I said to myself, what happens to the fool happens to me also. Why then have I been wise? We're all going to die. We all face the same fate. And I said to myself, this also is vanity. for there is no enduring remembrance of the wise or fools. So he asks, how can the wise die just like fools? Verse 17, so I hated life, because what was done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a chasing after wind. That was why I got so depressed in high school. I read this and said, what's the point? If the greatest, wisest person can't figure out anything better, what am I going to find? So, and yet, in verse 24, the teacher comes to some kind of a resolution, an acceptance. He says, there is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from God, who can eat or have any enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. So there's two different strains of thinking when we come to the thought that there's nothing after this life. And I'm not arguing that that's true, but from the perspective of the teacher here, if there's nothing after this life, where do we find meaning? One way is to be a nihilist, to believe in nothing, and to be a cynic. Nothing matters. It's all pointless. That's one possibility. Some might argue that that's where Nietzsche got to, where he gave up. Then there's the existentialist. The existentialist says, this is it. This is what we live for, is living in this moment. We have to create our own meaning. Whatever it is that compels you, that's what gives life meaning. And then some would say Karl Marx had something to say about it too. If there's nothing beyond this life, then we should create a socialist utopia. So far, those experiments haven't worked out very well, but I commend them for trying. So where's the meaning? And that's the struggle of Ecclesiastes. And that's the genius of this book. We're going to look at it, and we're going to wrestle with those questions. You know what? He doesn't come up with an answer. Even at the end of the book, he says, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. The very last he says in the book, the end of Ecclesiastes, is the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep God's commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, whether good or evil. But there's a lot in between the first verse and the last verse. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more here. I hope you join us. Thanks. For those watching, we're going to be having Bible studies on Zoom. If you need a Zoom link, you can email firstpresfhny@gmail.com to get a link to the Zoom Bible study. Thanks for watching.